When you look back at your baby feeding stories, do you feel proud of what you've accomplished? Are you able to remember clear details? Or is it more feelings of the experiences that linger? I've never been quite so shocked by a memory that took place in a breastfeeding interview before. I had to catch my breath throughout the course of this story as Tanya revealed a memory related to feeding her baby that she had not thought of in over 20 years. While the exact detail of this particular event is unique, it is an overall circumstance that so many people feeding human milk to their babies can relate to. So buckle up. This is a good one. I hope you love it as much as I do. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
My name is Tanya Tringali. I am a midwife. I am a mom of one who is 22 years old now, which is why we started the way we did. I am an educator. I make more midwives. It's one of my great passions in the world is making more midwives. And I have a small business and podcast, which I'm sure will come up throughout the story. My business is called MotherWit Maternity, and I have been working really closely with people doing virtual care. And that all ties into the story.
Can you tell me what your exposure was? Like, even going back to childhood, what did you see when it came to feeding babies? And then as you grew into thinking about having your own family?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so interesting that you're making me think back this far and think about it. I've never sat back and thought about that, shockingly. I probably saw people feed their babies from their breast, but I don't remember that. And so I come from a really large Puerto Rican family, and there were many babies. And so maybe everybody was formula fed. Like maybe that is the case since I have no overt memory. And I'm the second oldest of a gazillion grandchildren. So it's like I should remember. And given that I don't, it makes me wonder if everybody was formula fed. I grew up knowing that I was formula fed. And the reason that I understood that I was formula fed is because I was born premature at 34 weeks. And back in the day, there was not a ton of support for that kind of thing. So my mom always just said, I didn't get the chance to breastfeed you, right? I've never dug deep with her to find out how much of a loss that was for her or anything. But I knew I was formula fed. And I don't think I thought about breastfeeding a whole lot. I think another really relevant detail here is that I was a really young mom. So I was pregnant when I was 19. I was technically 20 when my child was born, but I was still basically a teenager. My journey to the choices that I made that were more holistic in nature were not born out of previous experience or exposure at all. It really came from a very singular experience that has nothing to do with breastfeeding up front, but my very first appointment with an OBGYN to confirm my pregnancy, basically. I literally picked a random name out of a book and went because I didn't know what to do. And I had a pretty bad experience. And I walked out of there as a 19-year-old who knew nothing, going, no freaking way. This is not the way. This cannot be how this happens. And I went on a hunt. And within days, I was huddled in corners of Barnes & Noble reading every book on pregnancy and birth and learning about midwives for the first time in my life. And that was really how this all happened for me. So breastfeeding was an evolution of that learning process, of course.
Right.
So I did come into it naive, but also extremely confident. I'm just going to have this baby at this freestanding birthing center with these midwives and everything's going to be perfect. And by and large, that happened for me. I have a beautiful birth story, a beautiful experience. It was hard. It was all the things, as was breastfeeding, very similarly. But I didn't come to this with a background or understanding, and I had never even thought for a moment about what it might mean to have.
It's funny because I'm sure you hear this too in your practice, people coming to it kind of with either viewpoint, and of course there's a spectrum, but you hear people with all the nerves, reading all the books, getting all the support they can up front, having heard all the horror stories, whether it's about birth or about baby feeding, or maybe they focus their energies on a little bit of both, or people coming to it where they say it's natural. People have been doing this for all of human history, and then are kind of blindsided when and if there are difficulties.
Yeah, totally. You know what's funny? You're making me think about, I'm reading the book Sapiens right now. One of the things he's talking about in the book, the human evolution through having been hunter-gatherers to being farmers. And there's this part where he's talking about how quickly in the span of one generation, these skills are lost. So even though farming comes with a huge bunch of other problems, and maybe life in a certain sense would be different or better if we had remained hunter-gatherers, within one generation, our skill of being hunter-gatherer was gone. And so when I think about that, it makes me think about breastfeeding and birthing babies and all the cultural things that come along with this. It's lost. It's lost on us. And we can't go back and get it again. All we can do is reinvent and start anew.
That's right. I talk about that all the time, that it is a lost skill. And we almost lost it culturally, like forever, really. Yeah. So you came to it with this sense of, I'm going to do all the reading I can in the corner of Barnes and Noble. There has to be a different way. Did you read anything specifically related to feeding your baby, or you were focused mostly on the birth?
I definitely focused mostly on the birth, and that's something that really impacts why I do some of the work that I do now. Is I say to my clients with great empathy that I completely understand that they can't think beyond the task of getting this baby out of their body, because it is this crazy, overwhelming thought, like, how does this even happen? And so I say to people, I know you can't think about this until you see your baby's toes, but we're going to try to carve out a little bit of time to talk about some of the things that we need to talk about. And thankfully, the people who are proactive enough to work with me in the style and the way that I work with people, I think they really get that. They've picked up that memo from somewhere. Unfortunately, a lot of my clients come to me with a lot of anxiety that they know that they have, and that is what's driving them to be proactive. It's such an interesting cycle. And then there's other people that are not anxious, and they're the ones probably that are like, yeah, I'm just going to do this. It's natural, right? Because they're not anxious types. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword for sure.
Were your care providers at the freestanding birth center, were they providing any sort of prenatal education when it came to breastfeeding?
So there was a childbirth education class that was taught in the building, and I attended that, and there was obviously some breastfeeding, not obviously, but the final class was like newborn care and breastfeeding. So I definitely learned the basics there, and there were some really great basics that stuck with me for a long time, or throughout my journey for sure. One memory that I just had today in preparing to tell this part of my story for the very first time, and because I was in the middle of realizing that I didn't get a lot of education or support once the baby was born. But then I had a memory that there was one thing that my provider did do extremely well, and that I almost didn't give her credit for. And that is that as I was approaching term, I don't remember exactly how many weeks I was, but I was definitely 37 plus, and I had my baby on my due date at 40 weeks. I'm a very punctual person. And I remember them saying, have you leaked any colostrum? And I said, no. And she asked permission to see if she could express some colostrum, and she tried and nothing came out. And she was like, interesting. And I remember her writing something down and then telling me, don't sweat it. Everybody's different. No big deal. We're just making note just in case. So I remember that. And then as far as I can remember, and I'm almost certain because I never gave a single drop of formula, despite the fact that I do view this as having had difficulties, which I'll explain in a moment. Um, my milk came in just fine, right? Everything seemed to be fine in that department. And I didn't know enough to be worried, and they did a good job at not worrying me excessively, but I don't feel like anything else really happened to help me after that. I had again, wonderful providers and a wonderful experience. I don't know if that's a product of the times, right? The year 2000 is the year my daughter was born. That's a long time ago. A whole lot has changed. I've been a midwife since 2007, and I know how much has changed since 2007 in terms of what we know, the state of the science, how clinicians are educated, the way we educate students now, the way in which we involve lactation specialists has evolved. I think in my case, I didn't go to them after the baby was out with a problem. So therefore, I didn't get any help. But I didn't know some of the things I was experiencing, that I could get help for those things.
And still so many people don't, right? Or they go to their pediatrician and the solution is always, if you feel like you don't have enough milk, the mother comes and says, or the person feeding the baby comes and says, I think I might not have enough milk. And then the pediatrician says, if you don't have enough milk, feed formula. So instead of doing the problem solving, or instead of referring to the people who know how to do the problem solving, we still have this cycle of saying, okay, then feed the baby something else.
Yeah.
And sometimes the solution is we need to feed the baby, and we need to feed the baby now.
Yeah.
While we problem solve, if that is what you would like to do. But not always. And we have to break this cycle of saying, just because a worry is in a person's brain, it does not mean that is in actuality, or sometimes it is in actuality, and we need to help figure out what is going on hormonally or milk supply wise. It's this constant, even though some things have changed since 2000, so many things have not changed.
Well, certainly the physiology has not changed, but how providers approach the topic, I hope, is changing, but it's changing slowly because it's changing one provider at a time.
Right.
And even in my role as a midwifery educator, do I believe that we give midwife students enough education on lactation? Absolutely not. We don't. We do our very best. I'm faculty at NYU, and we have an amazing midwife she's a home birth midwife and an IBCLC. Her name is Tanya Wills. I'll give her a big shout out here on your show. She comes in every semester and does a really big, great talk for our students. It's amazing. It's a wonderful talk. I love listening to it year after year. It's not enough. Then our students go to clinical largely in very busy settings. And what do we know about very busy settings? That's where we're getting quick eyes on people. Let's just get that baby on the breast as fast as we can so we can run to another person. And so, no, our students aren't coming out prepared. And it's kind of like, from the midwife perspective anyway, what I see is, for selfish reasons, maybe, we as people, especially childbearing people, I see us get interested in the things that are happening to us. So, for example, for the students that come in not having kids yet, their interest in breastfeeding gets piqued once they have themselves breastfed. Likewise, as we age, those of us who are aging start getting really interested in perimenopause, right? And now we're like, know about learning the latest and greatest on perimenopause. So our skill set evolves as we have personal experiences. So many of us who are in this profession did it because of a personal experience, be it an amazing one or the opposite, right?
Yes, I actually was reading this really interesting study about the care given by providers, both nurses and doctors, when it came to breastfeeding. And it said that it was largely shaped by personal experience or lack thereof. And so the care you would receive, for instance, in the recovery area of the hospital from nurses was largely shaped by their own attitudes towards breastfeeding. So if they had good positive feelings with breastfeeding, then they were going to help their patients receive that as well. But if they themselves had experiences with breastfeeding or had ended up formula feeding their children, then that was how they were going to then lead their patients.
Yeah. Fascinating, because I wonder now if that translates at all into how we work with people in the birthing room. I don't know if it does, because I definitely know people who had their own traumatic birth experiences and C-sections, and they're absolutely fantastic midwives. So I don't know if it holds, but boy, is that interesting.
I think with anything else, you have to identify your biases. And once you
Yeah.
know you have a bias, then you can
Mhm.
work to counteract that bias. But
Absolutely.
these professionals did not know about their biases and were
Mhm.
continuing to propagate
Perpetuate
those.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Cool. Wow.
Are you feeling like you had quick eyes on you when you started feeding your baby? Do you have lots of questions about your individual baby feeding experience? I would love to be the person who teams up with you for a 90-minute consult in your home if you're local, or virtually if you aren't. This will not feel rushed. You will have a lot of time to ask a lot of questions. We will have time to get to know each other. I will observe feedings, get a history of anything that might be impacting milk supply. I will learn what has been going on up until this point in time. Let's team up to decrease your baby feeding anxiety. You can reach me, as always, at www.quabbinbirthservices.com.
You have this birth in a freestanding birth center. Talk about your birth and how you think your birth experience impacted your baby feeding, either negatively or positively. So given all you know about how birth can impact baby feeding hormonally and how that birth experience can impact
Yeah.
babies, think back to that experience and then tell us about those first moments and days.
My gut instinct is to say that my birth did not in any significant way affect my breastfeeding journey. I did have a wonderful birth. So the only place in which there is an effect, I think, is that I had a fairly long labor. Not crazy long, but a good 28 hours. And so I was sleep deprived at the time of birth, as many people are. So I don't think the birth itself was a big player, but I think that as much as I am an enormous supporter and fan of birth centers, going home 8 to 12 hours after birth and then feeling like you don't know what you don't know, that's probably where some of my problems began. And yeah, they sent a visiting nurse 2 days later, so that was great at that point. So what I remember is that I definitely had some nasty cracked nipples for a few days, but they healed up pretty quickly as my milk came in. And I joked I'm a very small breasted person, but I was a D for a day. Literally one day. When my milk came in, that's another area where I was like too naive to understand what was happening. First of all, I was absolutely fascinated by suddenly like looking down and seeing boobs.
Yeah.
And I was excited about keeping them. I was looking forward to them not hurting, but still being that way. I was like, this will be fun. It's like getting a new.
Yeah.
And I went and bought a nursing bra that day that fit those breasts, and then I had to give it away.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, that I always laugh about that. So yeah, the engorgement
D
was
for
real.
a day.
D for a day. The engorgement was real, but it was brief. And the cracked nipples, I still remember how horrible that was. The like toe curling, horrible pain, but they healed quickly. And I never had a problem like that again. I never had mastitis. I never had anything else. And I breastfed exclusively for exactly 18 months. So the thing is, it's like, okay, is that all there is to it? Almost. The one big thing that stuck with me throughout is that I started working as a doula literally the day I was 6 weeks postpartum. I attended my
Whoa.
doula trainings while I was like in the first weeks postpartum, brought my baby with me, the whole bit. I started attending births, then I went very quickly, 3 births, forget this, I'm going to nursing school. Very quickly, I'm going to midwifery school. Like it was just one after the other. So I was away more and more with time. And that is where I started to feel like I was fighting for my milk supply.
Mm.
And I was so attached to exclusively breastfeeding. It was never even a thought that I would give a drop of formula. But from the very first time I pumped in a bathroom stall that was dirty and gross, I couldn't get milk into that darn thing. So I pretty quickly understood, or thought I understood, that my milk transfer, I didn't think in these words yet, but that my milk transfer directly to my baby was probably fine, but that it was just that I had a problem with the pump. I don't know if that's actually true, of course. I have no way of knowing. My baby measured consistently in the 5th percentile for height and weight her entire life. She is still very short. My child is a grown woman who wears a size 5 shoe. She's a small person.
Yeah.
I'm not a big person and she's smaller than me. So I always believed, as my pediatrician did, that she was constitutionally small. Little inkling in my mind, not a ton, that maybe that was evidence of something, but she never dropped off. She was a little baby and remained a little baby. So I let that thought go. But it's something I sit with as I think through things carefully with all this hindsight. So the more and more I was away and the more I needed to pump, the more stress there was to pump milk and the harder it got to pump milk. And I eventually got to the point where even nursing her, it was clear I wasn't like totally satisfying her. But she also became super resistant to bottles, like right away. She was a baby that practically refused a bottle. I'll never forget the day that with her gummy little gums, she ripped a nipple out of the bottle and like threw the bottle of milk across the room, which was so sad. You know, that loss of milk that's so sad, especially when you're struggling for it. So I changed her over to a sippy cup at a much younger age than you're supposed to, and that worked fine. So she would get a sippy cup of my breast milk while I was away. I made a big habit. The one thing I figured out on my own, and I recommend this to people all the time, and very few people actually like to do this, but I recommend it anyway. For those that the trick I learned was that I had to pump while I was nursing to take advantage of my actual real letdown with my human baby.
So you would nurse on one side, pump on the other side with the electric pump.
Yep. That was the only way I could keep up. So that was what I did. And so every nursing session was a pumping session, and it was really hard. That was such a hard time. And I think some of the things I think about now are like all the things I didn't know to ask and the things that no one thought to ask me. Like there was no check-in at that point. And don't blame my providers at this point, because now I'm months postpartum. So unless you come to them, they don't know, they're on to the next group. But I didn't go to anyone to say, hey, my milk supply is dropping and I'm really fighting for it. What can I do? So I never got those answers. Don't know if I would have. Let's check your phalange size, like all the tricks in the book that I didn't do any of them. I now know that the phalange that comes with the breast pump is rarely the right size for everyone. I was probably not using the right size. So for 20 plus years, I was not 20 plus years because I've had these thoughts for a while, but I was chalking up my experience to a lack of oxytocin because I was in a dirty bathroom. And not to say that wasn't it, but that is what I spent a number of years believing was at the root of why I couldn't pump. But now I look back and think of all these other tricks. No one taught me that maybe I could do some like power pumping after I checked the phalange. So, like all the different things that I know to say to people now as suggestions. I got none of that. I learned those tricks from IBCLCs throughout my career. I didn't learn them in midwifery school. It's like the only way most of us learn this stuff when it's specific to lactation is to befriend very good and as many as possible IBCLCs.
And you were on an island.
Yeah.
You were on an island, even though you were in the birth world, surrounded by people who were interested in this type of thing and providing support to people. You were going to nursing school and midwifery school, maybe not midwifery school by the time you were probably done pumping by then.
Yeah.
You know, you were surrounded by people who cared about this type of thing, but it can feel hard to be surrounded by it and be supporting other birthing people and to be struggling, I can imagine, with your own milk supply.
Totally, totally. And something I just remembered that's really sweet is one of my first births as a doula. It was my second birth. I actually had a hand pump when I attended my first birth and going into my second birth. I didn't own an electric pump. And I was so new at being a doula that I wasn't charging much in the way of money. And the person who I was working with was so grateful for my services, even before the birth, that she gifted me, I believe it was on the day her labor started, she gifted me my Medela Pumpin' Style.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I love that story.
Yeah, I'm just like, I didn't forget that per se, but I haven't thought about that in a really long time. So I was like, oh my God, I have a double electric pump. This is incredible. And I thought that was going to be a game changer.
Pre-Affordable Care Act, when anyone who had insurance could get
That's why I didn't have one, because they were expensive and I didn't understand the value yet.
Right.
But then suddenly, like by the time I was in nursing school, I was like hauling my like briefcase style, pumping style into the NYU dirty bathroom and using the ice compartment and all of that. Honestly, even on 9/11, I was stuck whole other crazy thing. I was stuck in the city, separate from my baby. Towers fall. And hauling my pumpkin style and huge fat textbooks in a backpack all over New York City, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do before I even understood what was going on. That's a whole other trauma. But yeah, crazy times to like think about that breast pump.
So can we go back to that on that day on 9/11? Are you willing to talk about that for a minute? Because
oh yeah, sure.
Okay, so you were pumping. You were an NYU nursing student.
Yeah, I have to think of how old my daughter was at that point. So it was the first week of nursing school at NYU for me. So September 11th was the very first week of school.
Okay.
It was like maybe it was a Thursday or something. I can't remember the day of the week, Wednesday or Thursday. And I was in anatomy and physiology lab. But let me just think real quick. So she was a little over 1 already. I was still obviously pumping. Yeah.
Yeah. And you remember lugging around your big pumping bag.
Yeah.
And where was your daughter? Did you have her? Was she in daycare?
She was with her dad at home in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And anyone who knows that skyline knows, well, from the part of Williamsburg that I was in, you could open your window. I could open my window and look out the window to the right, and I could see the two twin towers. Just straight, perfect view. The crazy part of that story is that one of my good friends who lived on Staten Island was babysitting for me while I was just getting settled in nursing school, figuring out how this was all going to go. And she would take the Staten Island ferry to Lower Manhattan that gets off at the towers, pick up my daughter, and sometimes take her back home for the day. So I didn't know where she was. I didn't know if she was too close to the towers at that point. But the long story short, she never made it out of the house because my friend was on the ferry that swooped in, took people onto the ferry, and turned around and went back to Staten Island as the first tower fell, or before the first tower fell, however that timing played out. So my daughter was home with her dad at that time, thankfully. But I was trying to figure out how the heck to get back to Brooklyn.
And so were you even, there's so much to the story, but were you even thinking about your milk?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because I ended up at my partner's job. So she worked for the United Teachers Federation at the time, and I knew where her work was. So I walked from Washington Square, which is like a southern part, but north of the towers. I walked further north because that seemed to be the right thing to do. She was on like something like 23rd Street, and I went to her office so that I could be in a somewhat comfortable place to pump and figure out what was going on in the world. Because at that point, I still thought we were under attack. That's what I thought was happening. Right. I didn't understand.
As so many people did. Yeah, we were. But not the whole city.
I thought we were like being bombed or something.
Everybody.
I did not understand. Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to stop for a minute and honor all the people in New York City who that day were young parents producing milk for their babies and had to both figure out like where they were going, how they were getting home, how they were getting to their children, and get milk out of their bodies.
Yeah.
Like, we think about the labor of milk making, and my mind is just blown right now that on a day like 9/11, think about all the people who are making milk and still had to keep making milk
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
a day like that. And you were one of them.
Yeah, I never really thought about it before. And I'm realizing, so I finished doing the math that I wasn't able to do well while I was like rushing to make that thought. I officially stopped breastfeeding 2 months later, it seems, by my
Uh-huh.
math, because I
Yeah.
breastfed until she was 18 months old. So it seems that's where that falls. So I'm like, oh, could there have been a stress relationship there? Because I no longer remember where the big dips were. But what I do remember for sure is that in those final weeks or months, I remember like literally nothing coming out but
Yeah.
drops. And I eventually stopped pumping because it was a useless endeavor.
Whether you have gone through something as traumatic as the events of 9/11 while breastfeeding, or some other tragedy, such as the loss of a family member, financial hardship, the loss of a job, stress in your relationship, postpartum anxiety, postpartum depression or psychosis, I just want to take a minute to pause and honor the stressors that made breastfeeding difficult for you too. This is hard. And I know that you worked as hard as you could. And if you are a breastfeeding supporter, your clients are working as hard as they can. We get such little support in the postpartum period. And when we add additional stressors, when we add trauma on top of the ordinary postpartum stress, sometimes it becomes impossible to make the milk we need to feed our babies. So I applaud anyone who has tried, whether you were successful and continued to make milk during a period like this or not.
And then the reason I stopped nursing was because I don't know for anyone out there who's ever nursed when milk is not coming out, it just doesn't feel the same. It becomes this kind of agitating, annoying feeling because your baby's trying to figure out how to get more milk to come out. Not only are they frustrated, but even if they are just sucking and a little pacifier, it just isn't the same. And I would be like managing my emotions at that point and trying to figure out what I was supposed to do, but I didn't. Weaning was not taught to me, right? Like, how do you wean a baby? I didn't know how. That's something I work with people very closely on, whether they're weaning really early or later in the game. And so that was definitely one of the most difficult parts that I haven't thought about.
Yeah. So not only were you dealing with being right there during this really traumatic event for the entire world, really, but now the additional trauma of losing this breastfeeding relationship that worldwide trauma contributed to.
It might have.
Yeah, that's something else, really. And you talked about having low oxytocin and that contributing to your low milk supply, pumping in dirty bathrooms. Of course, when you experience an event like being separated from your baby during an attack like 9/11, and then all the after effects of that, of course it's going to be hard to get them for a long time after that, which then contributes to lower releases of prolactin over time.
Yeah, definitely.
Wow. Thank you so much for being willing to share that story.
Wow, I didn't even know that was coming.
Yeah.
I told you before we did this that I have never tried to tell this story, so I actually didn't even know what was gonna come out, what I would remember. And I, again, remembered a couple details that were interesting to me before we spoke. And then speaking to you, I'm remembering even more. It's just such a crazy experience.
Yeah, it really is amazing to go back and think about these times. A lot of people really do. We talk about our birth stories a lot more. And so you talk about not really knowing how to wean. Was it hard for your daughter, that weaning time, when you didn't have a lot of milk and you were feeling so many emotions about being so uncomfortable?
I'm sure it must have been. My memories are a little scattered on that.
Mm-hmm.
What I remember most is that each time she came to the breast, she was never satisfied the way she had previously been. Like, she never fell asleep at the breast anymore. She was always like a little grunty and squirmy and frustrated. And I was feeling the same. So there was this whole like, if I could just relax, this would be
Right.
better. So making the decision to stop was hard, but 100% was the right decision. And the thing that eased the transition, which I look back and it's one of the most adorable things, even though it's absolutely disgusting. So, those really thin, bigger burp cloths that are meant to be cloth diapers, but the really big, thin ones, right? At some point, when she was a newborn, we'd gotten a pack of those, whatever. So they were like burp cloths over the shoulder. My daughter always did this thing with her little fingers over the shoulder. She would start gathering it up and shoving it in her mouth. Maybe this is a sign that she was still hungry. All these years later, I am literally thinking this thought for the first time right now. But anyway, she would put it in her mouth and she would suck on a little piece of the diaper cloth. And she was like Lionel in Snoopy.
Oh my God.
Okay. So as she learned to like crawl and stand, there was always this freaking blankie. We called it the blankie, but she had 24 blankies because we would change it out because it was disgusting. So as she got a little older, she would switch out the piece and get a clean piece and switch it out and get a clean piece. And they would get stinky and they would get dirty. It was just awful. So as we got rid of the blankie officially on her first day of kindergarten. So what started to happen, we started with 24 blankies and we never replaced them. When they got too gross and had to be thrown away, the supply just got whittled down and she was down to 2 or 3 as she started kindergarten, and we put them away and she never got it back and it went away. She got over it. But I think she just really liked to suck, but she didn't suck her thumb. She never took a pacifier. She detested bottles. So I don't know why this was because certainly it wasn't for like lack of being given the breast, because I co-slept until I had a 7-year-old, for the record. I don't necessarily recommend this, but I had a baby in my bed until she was 7. The story of how I got her out of my bed is actually a fun one too, but she had access to the breast all the time. She breastfed all night long and we learned how to do that. So yeah, I don't know how hard it was for her. I saw I said we called it the blankie and I'm completely lying. We called it raggy. It was called raggy.
Oh.
I said blankie because of talking about Lionel. Right. I knew something wasn't right with that. It was called raggy. It seemed to me that in some capacity she used raggy as her transition out of breastfeeding. But I don't even know if I understood that at the time, because she started doing that as a newborn. Like taking it from my shoulder and shoving it in her mouth. So again, that the thought that I'm having right now was my baby always hungry?
Yeah. Okay. So all of this, we've heard a little bit about your professional journey as you entered your motherhood journey, specifically related to breastfeeding. But you became a midwife, and then slowly over time, you've built up, in addition to teaching for NYU, you've built up your own business as well, MotherWit. So tell us how this kind of led you, all of your learnings over the years and your own experience as a mother. How did this lead to building your own private practice, and how do you support people in their birth and postpartum journeys?
Yeah, so I did what we in the midwife world call full-time, full scope practice for 15 plus years, meaning I saw people in the office and caught babies in a hospital. I did all the things, primary care, GYN, all of it. And our modern medical system is broken. We all know that. Everybody listening to this show, I think, knows that to some degree, or they're in the process of learning that. And that brokenness doesn't only affect consumers of healthcare, it affects the givers of healthcare as well.
Absolutely.
And so for a number of years leading up to my daughter going to college, I knew I was going to have to make a change in my life, that this wasn't sustainable for me anymore. I felt that I couldn't provide the kind of care that I believed people deserved. I saw every shortcoming of our care more and more clearly and acutely as time went on, and it was eating me up. And so I really wanted to give people what I thought we weren't giving them. And the idea started in one place, and it has certainly gone to many other places, as these entrepreneurial endeavors typically do. For me, it started with fitness in the perinatal period, in that I really believed that fitness and nutrition were like the tools we weren't tapping into, that we in healthcare, no matter what you are, what profession you technically fall into, we don't get enough education in it. We get next to no education in it, in fact. And yet all of our clients come to us with very particular questions about these topics that we are not able to answer. And so we say whatever the heck we want, whatever comes to mind, whatever we think we've heard someone say before us. We're not speaking truth. Not to mention, the existing guidelines on things are incredibly vague. They're not always based on evidence, despite calling themselves evidence-based guidelines. So we don't have a lot to work with as healthcare providers. And so this is not about shaming any individual. I am that individual. But the fitness piece became super important to me. So I became a trainer. I got my CrossFit level 1 coach. I took some pregnancy and postpartum athleticism certifications and some other coursework with physical therapists, and it became my world. And it started that I wanted to work with people around this idea of keeping people active through pregnancy, helping them get back to their activities postpartum. But what ended up happening was, especially those people who were postpartum, half of our sessions would turn into something else, lactation or whatever it was that they needed. And got mental health, crying on the floor, we're doing that instead, whatever. The people's time became people's time. And I never knew if they were going to show up for Tanya the midwife or Tanya the trainer, or what was going to happen. And so then COVID hit. And everything had to go virtual. And suddenly people were really in need. And people were really recognizing the gaps in care that were already there, but that were amplified by COVID. And I ended up developing what I call comprehensive postpartum care, which basically to me means 99% of what needs to be done in the postpartum period can be done virtually, including my assistance with fitness, whether that be in the form of training, coaching sessions, figuring out how to breathe, lift again. We just bring our computers, our laptops, our phones, whatever, each into our individual gyms, and we work through problems together. I do it with people all the time. There's still a huge fitness piece, but the postpartum piece really got fleshed out, in that I really sat down and wrote down every single thing that people need someone to touch base on, to ask them about. We shouldn't have to be like how it was with me, where I didn't know what to ask. I didn't know I could ask. I now make sure I broach the subject with everyone and give them the opportunity to go, oh, I hadn't even thought of that. Yes, I do have some questions. Or, hey, I'm not ready to unpack that yet. Okay, let's table that for 2 weeks. So my care is incredibly comprehensive and ongoing, and it basically involves, in my subscription model anyway, it involves standing 2-week video calls and unlimited texting and communication by multiple means on a daily basis throughout the program. And what's happened lately, which has been really great, is people are starting to jump on board earlier and earlier, to the point where I work with people in the preconception period who recognize some struggles that they may have in having a healthy pregnancy or getting pregnant in the first place. And then people are using me as an adjunct through their prenatal care, because we all know prenatal care visits are not long enough with most providers. So short of a home birth midwife or a very small practice midwife, the truth is, even really great midwives who work in busy practices like I did can't give you what we want to give you. And that's not dissing the individual. Again, it's the system. And because we don't get to give this care, we aren't versed at it. And so now I have years under my belt of doing these really nuanced things and working with people very deeply around fitness, nutrition, mental health, sleep, lactation, pelvic floor, you name it. And we don't leave any stone unturned. And at the end of the day, I am a midwife, not a specialist. And so sometimes I call on my colleagues, my IBCLCs and my mental health professionals and the pelvic floor physical therapists and the sleep coaches, you name it. When I cannot do anymore, I have a team of people that jump in and take over where I leave off. And it's been a really beautiful thing. And out of that grew a desire to tell people stories similarly to you. So I started a podcast to share my clients' journeys and stories and educate people on the different ways that the perinatal period can evolve for individuals, what it looks like to get help. And of course, from there, you start interviewing experts and all of that stuff. So it's turned into a really wonderful opportunity to be in community with people like you, actually. And it's really wonderful.
Yeah, that's amazing. It should not always be up to the patient to say, oh, this might be a problem that I should be bringing to a provider. But that's what our medical system has left us with, is that patients are home alone for long periods of time without providers checking in on them. And they just think all of the things that they are experiencing must be normal because they don't have anybody saying, hey, is this going on for you? Or are you feeling this way? How's this going? And that's very isolating, and it leads to much higher rates of postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety. And you see it all the time in the large postpartum groups online on Facebook, where people are just turning to other parents who they don't know, who are just strangers online, saying, hey, is this normal? When they really should have better resources than that, better, more knowledgeable resources.
Yeah.
And so that's a really great model that you have. So that's really amazing that you've been able to pull all of those things together to provide that support to people.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have so appreciated this really unique conversation.
Yeah, I think the final thought I want to leave for your listeners is that it's okay to accept that you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And better than you trying to become a sudden expert so that you can identify. To me, that what's happening there is, and I'm just as guilty as the next person, it's trying to stay in control of something that we are not in control of. Your better bet is to line up help. And I don't even mean that you need to pay me or Lo or anyone like that. But what does help look like to you? There are plenty of free resources out there. I put them up on my website. I'm sure you offer them too. We all know how to help you get free resources. Most of us do much of this work out of the goodness of our heart. We don't do this because it makes millions. So get that thought out of your mind. We do this because we really want to help people. And when somebody reaches out to me and they need free resources, I take the time to get them the free resources.
Yeah.
So get yourself set up for help rather than try to become an expert.
Yeah, that was actually one question I had for you that I didn't get a chance to ask, is in those times when you were struggling, were you aware of any resources in your community that you could turn to, peer support resources or groups that you went to?
Yeah, actually, that is the one thing that I did do, which is the birthing center had something going on every single day for new parents. And many of those things were breastfeeding support groups. And I went to them not because I thought I needed help with breastfeeding, but because I needed to be around other mothers and babies. And I stress that all the time with people. I was there because I had to get out of the house. I had to move. And just the act of every single day, getting out of the house, getting on the subway, getting into the city, I would go to the group. We would end up at the park with a group of moms having a cup of coffee. I'd swing by the grocery store, get what I needed, go home. And I'd squandered 4 hours of the day that needed to be squandered some other way than just sitting in the house staring at my baby.
Yes.
And getting out of the house is a huge milestone for people. And sometimes I get people out of the house quickly and sometimes I don't. But every single time I get someone out of the house, they don't regret it.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody's different. Everybody walks their own path. But yeah, so support groups are an absolute godsend. They don't solve all your problems when there are real problems, especially if you don't even acknowledge the problem or know what the problem is. I am guilty of that. But they are an enormous resource nonetheless.
Yes, absolutely. Even if you just need to sit in a room with other people and cry and say, I'm struggling, it's not going to solve all your problems, but it's going to help you feel less alone when you're having problems.
Yep.
And that can go a long way. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your experiences. We'll link all of your resources in the show notes so that if people want to reach out, it'll be really easy for them to do so.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's really nice to be on the other side of the mic, and it was really exciting to have a conversation that I didn't know where it was going to go.
Yeah, it was so good to hear these amazing stories.
Thank you.
Giving birth and feeding our babies are formative experiences in our lives. So many times, feelings associated with these experiences hold strong, if not the exact memories. And for birth workers like myself and Tanya, our experiences change the course of our lives, thrusting us towards career changes, which give us the opportunity to help our clients and patients feel as supported as possible while they are birthing and feeding their babies. Tanya saw the systemic barriers that existed, first as a patient and then as a practitioner, and saw how both sides of that relationship were impacted. And she is creatively working to solve for the problems by filling in the gaps to create continuity of care and asking the questions that many providers just don't have the time to ask. Whether you are another provider or someone who is in the perinatal stage of life, I encourage you to make a connection with Tanya, whether it's by emailing her, signing up for a course, or following her on Instagram, all linked in the show notes. It takes like-minded people building relationships to problem solve at scale. And speaking of problem solving at scale, care providers and parents alike, if you are fed up with systemic and cultural barriers that make feeding our babies so challenging, join my growing Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook, where we discuss all the barriers that make it difficult for feeding our babies in hopes of one day making a big impact and changing those barriers. See you there. Bye. Hey, Julie.
What?
So I was wondering if you had any ideas about how to help a breastfeeding parent who is feeling really stressed out right after they had their baby.
I would say it would be best if you breastfeed if your body he can. But I will give them a bottle in case they can't.
Oh, so you would give them another way to feed their baby if they were feeling stressed out about it?
Yep.
Great. Thanks.